even members of the European Parliament are capable of reading opinion polls. And in order to try to sweeten the deal, what I expect will happen, if the application remains on the table, which is your call, and if the referendum goes ahead, my guess is that at the last minute, in the negotiations, the most incredible rabbit will be drawn from the hat, which is that you'll be told that a special exemption has been negotiated on fisheries. It will take the form of a codicil or an appendix to the treaties. And it will say something like, Iceland shall have sovereignty over its maritime territorial resources, something like that. If there's one thing that you take from what I'm saying today, it's this. That is worthless unless it is written into the main part of the treaty as a structural change to the common fisheries policy. We have almost all within the EU been through the experience of where we think we have negotiated an opt-out, only to find that the European Court of Justice then rules very differently when the issue is tested in court. The supreme example of this, from a British point of view, but all other countries will have their own version of this story, was the social chapter, the rules on common social and employment policy. We were in a much stronger position when that was negotiated in 1992 than we would have been as an applicant country hoping to join. We were an existing member state, and in order to use the EU structures to adopt these common social policies and rules on working time and so on, the other countries needed unanimity. They couldn't do it without British permission. So we had a very, very strong position. They were coming asking us for something rather than the other way around. Well, in the end, we said, okay, we have no problem. This was the John Major government in 1992. He said, we have no problem with the European Union using EU institutions and structures to implement the common social policies and employment laws that you propose, but only on the basis that Britain is not covered. Okay? So we instructed our lawyers to draw up the derogation in the clearest language that they could find, and they did. And anyone reading that declaration would have been completely satisfied. None of us thought that there would be any problem. A couple of years later, when it was first tested in the court, we found that we were subjected to the maximum 48-hour working week, because the European Court sees it as its role, very overtly, to be a motor of European integration, to uphold the commitment in the opening line of the Treaty of Rome to ever closer union. And so any conflict between an appendix to the treaties and the treaty itself will always be upheld in favor of the treaty itself. If you want an exemption on fisheries, the only way of making it stick is to change the common fisheries policy itself so that you abolish the concept of equal access to a common resource and you introduce or reintroduce the idea of territorial jurisdiction out to 200 miles or the median line as allowed under maritime law. If you do that, then it might just stand in court. But you must be prepared for the government to come back and say, well, we've got this fantastic deal on fisheries, look, here it is. And that will last for a few months until the first Spanish vessel goes to the European Court and says, we're being denied our rights under the treaty. I want to leave time for discussion, so let me just close by saying this. As I said at the outset, this has got to be your decision. Look at the thing, decide what are your problems, what are the proportionate solutions to those problems, and then decide whether EU membership is part of the necessary solution. But either way, settle the issue through an act of national collective democratic will, in other words, through a referendum. The worst thing, I would have thought, is to leave the issue unresolved, both in terms of business confidence and in terms of the simple security that all investors are looking for. Decide that within the next 18 months, you are going to have a referendum, and then one way or the other, you will stick to the result. Either we will all know that you've decided to join the European Union, or you can put in place a permanent or semi-permanent structure for another generation as an alternative to full EU membership. The worst thing to do is to drag the thing out indefinitely. So I hope that I hope that you'll trust the people rather than leaving this only to the politicians. And I would certainly put my trust in the people of this country, who I've come to know and respect over most of my adult life. The thing that is bred in the bones of every Icelander is autonomy, independence. The thing that brought this country in 2 generations from subsistence farming and fishing to one of the highest standards of living in the world is the enterprise that comes from generations of scratching a living from the thin soil of this little isolated scrap of tundra in the middle of the North Atlantic. The greatest resource you have is the risk-taking, the ambition, the enterprise, the self-reliance, and the understanding of independence as a political concept, that there is a connection between living in an independent state and living independently of the state, understanding that people are autonomous individuals who should look to themselves for solutions before they look to the government. That is the attitude that has made you prosperous and free and strong. Think hard before you throw it away.
Thank you very much for a very interesting speech. Now we have 10 or 15 minutes for discussions, and please just signal me if you have a question, and please say your name and keep it short so that we can have more questions. Okay, Gisli, Kjosvar.
Thank you, Mr. Hannan, for a very good lecture. My name is Gisli Tryggvason, and I'm a lawyer by profession and consumer spokesman currently. I'm delighted to hear some very legitimate arguments against EU membership and on the fact of the flaws, and to hear your caveats for our accession if it goes through. My problem is, just as in 92 or 3, when I opposed EEA accession on the constitutional grounds, that the democratic deficit is so big for Iceland now and has been for 15 years. We have this supranational element that you described, and we have no possibility for having our influence on the legislation we abide. What is your answer? Should we go out of this associate membership, or should we apply, or is there some middle ground?
Should we maybe collect?
Yeah, of course.
Two more.
Good idea.
Thank you for a very enlightening lecture, Mr. Hannan. My name is Brynja Halldóttir, and I am chairman of ESA against EU membership. Since you value democracy very much, I would like to ask you, what's your opinion on withdrawing the application? Do you find that as undemocratic?
Thank you, Mr. Hannan, for a terrific lecture. My name is Benjamin. I just wanted to ask a short question about the difference maybe in politics on the EU in the UK and Iceland. Do you find that pro-EU parties, whenever they can't, or politicians, when all else fails, they resort to petty accusations of nationalism or nationalist tendencies by the Eurosceptic?
Breeds a very healthy and effective democracy. In a situation where most people in a constituency know their representatives and can reasonably expect to have access to them, you have something which you will probably not appreciate until you lose it, which is confidence in the ability of the ballot box to effect realistic change in policy. And that is something, frankly, that we don't really have in the United Kingdom. The most common response that you get on the doorstep, politicians of all 3 parties will tell you this if they're being honest, the most common thing you hear on the doorstep is, it doesn't make any difference how I vote, nothing is going to change.